we are happy. We are happy to be hosting you all, and so a couple of things. It's been a big week, with the announcement of Leo. I'm currently just outside Villanova. Was working in the province offices this week, and there's just an incredible buzz. It's very exciting, and so we hope that that continues to carry forward. We've had more than 100 inquiries for vocations just in the last few days.
Wow.
And so yeah, we think we as Augustinians have not necessarily been on the radar, relative to other orders, and now we are. And so that brings with it great benefits. It also brings with it great responsibilities, that we live up to it. And so hopefully this series and what's to follow will help us do just that. So again, for the benefit of those who are joining for the first time, we are largely here an online community of Augustinians. So we do have lay Augustinian chapters at Augustinian parishes, and for those of us who are not co-located with an Augustinian parish, we come together virtually here. The purpose in doing so is, to bond as an Augustinian community, and to continue in our own spiritual journeys. We're currently working through the confessions, Augustine's confessions, and we're being guided by Kevin Bergdorf, who is just a great blessing to us all. A former entrepreneur turned evangelist, basically. Studied Augustine in Oxford, translated confessions into Latin. So he's a true scholar and expert, and he's the guy leading us today. For those joining the first time, we are on book 5 of Confessions. We say book, but it's really kind of chapters as we think of it. The other chapters are posted online and on the website. And we will move forward with one book per month until we're done with the series, with all the books for Confessions at the end of this year. But we'll also, really just because, our online community is growing now, we'll also be adding a few other events, on Augustine himself, on living the rule as a layperson, and other topics that we think may help us all grow in our Augustinian spirituality. So with that, I'm gonna pipe down. I'm gonna offer a really quick prayer, and then I'm going to go on mute and turn the mic over to Kevin, who will take over from here. So please pray with me for just a moment. Dear God, we are so incredibly grateful for Leo. It is as though a family member truly is now in the most arduous job that any Catholic can have. And so, as he indicated, he needs our help and our prayer as he carries his cross for you. And so we pray that we do that. We pray that we are arduous in our prayers for him. We pray that we are active in our support for him. And we pray that we do our part to bring your love to all people everywhere, guided by Augustine and his rule. Amen. So thank you again for joining. And Kevin, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Sarah, I think we might need to close the share screen in order for me to be in speaker view and share a couple slides here in a minute. I'll keep rolling while you get that sorted. Okay. I think we're in a good place now. So welcome back. As Jim said, we're in book 5 tonight. So let me give you a sketch. This is going to look really similar to how we've approached this, although book 5 has points of interest of its own that are quite different from things that we've encountered up to this point. But let me give you a sketch of the plan for tonight, and then we'll jump in and I'll try to share my screen and share a couple of visuals that I think will help fill in, so you're not required to just use your imagination for some of the things that I'm describing. But with that said, we'll jump in here. So we're going to kind of borrow a page from last time, which is at the beginning, we're going to figure out what's really the best way to title book 5. And I made much ado about this last time, and I think for good reason. And I'll talk about that in a second. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time here, but I do want to talk about maybe the most appropriate way to think of finding the center, as we talked about last time for book 5. And then we'll have a quick discussion about the structure of book 5, which is internally what's going on with the structure of book 5, and then what's the relationship of book 5 to books 1 through 4 and 6 through 9. And so if you're new to this, this will at least give you a flyby of books 1 through 4 and help to set book 5 in context. If you have been reading in anticipation of this, great. Then this should give a lot of color to what you've read. If you haven't had a chance to read book 5 yet, that's not really a problem. This likewise will give you a sketch to help you as you make your journey into the text. So after we talk about structure, we'll highlight, as our pattern has been, that there's so much in every book. I mean, really, there are graduate level classes that could just take a book or two of Confessions and spend their entire semester on it, and we're moving at obviously a much more deliberate pace. So I have to be selective, but I am going to choose the 5 or 6 things that I think are highlights. That doesn't mean things I don't talk about aren't immensely valuable or important, but there just has to be some process given the fact that I've got about 40 minutes at most to talk and then a little bit of time for questions. So let's talk about the title. We have, of course, run into this challenge before. I make a big deal about this for this reason, at least, because Augustine only gave a title to the work as a whole. He referred to this as the 13 books of my Confessions. He didn't give titles to any of the individual books. He didn't provide chapter headings. There were no such things as footnotes in the sorts of documents that Augustine or his contemporaries would have produced. And so when we're encountering the text in translation in English, which is how the vast majority of people are necessarily going to encounter it, and there's a lot of editorial and therefore interpretive decisions being made when we come to the title of a chapter, the title of a section, etc. But what I'd like to try to share with you to give you some perspective. Everybody's seeing this easily.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. So this is an important document, and you'll know why in just a moment. Try to clear the screen. Right. This is referred to in scholarly circles, which we don't really care about for our purposes, but this is Caesarianus 55. This is the name of the manuscript. I think it's housed in Rome. I don't remember the name of the library. This is the earliest copy that has survived of the Confessions. This is page 1. Magnus est Domine et laudabilis valde, and so on and so on. This is the opening line. Great are you, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. So I'm showing you this for a reason. Oh, incidentally, this is probably, there's a little bit of debate about the dating. This document we're looking at was probably produced in the 490s. So within about one lifetime of Augustine, but this is the earliest extant copy of the Confessions. I'm pointing this out for a couple of reasons. One, you will notice not only are there no chapter headings, there's no punctuation, there's no gaps between words, there are no lowercase letters. This is a document that actually is designed to be read out loud. This is for oral recitation. So when Augustine wrote the Confessions and he says, the 13 books of my Confessions, this is what he and his original audience and his contemporaries would have experienced when they encountered the text. So I say all this in part to kind of justify the whole exercise of thinking hard about why we give titles to the books that we encounter. Well, like we said before, the title is important because it's supposed to tell us what's actually going on, what's it about. And for another, as I think we demonstrated last time, editors sometimes supply titles in a way that makes one point rather than another, or maybe even misses the point. To harken back to the beginning, we talked about the title of Confessions. I think everybody that's here now probably recalls this. the first thing that comes to mind when someone hears the title of the book, The Confessions, is, to the contemporary mind, our contemporary mind, probably the sacrament of reconciliation, but this is completely wrong. This is not what Augustine's talking about. In fact, there was a very important article by Joseph Ratzinger. Most of you are going to know the other name that he goes by, but he wrote an article in 1957 called Originality and Tradition in Augustine's Concept of Confession. He was actually one of the first scholars. This is obviously a long time before he was Pope. He was one of the first scholars to help people see this distinction of confession in Augustine is fundamentally confession of praise. The idea of confession of sin is really a secondary idea. So title matters. Okay, last time we looked at the title of book 4, and we considered what other people had said, including me, and critiqued all of those, and we landed on a grief observed. You might remember this. We stole from C.S. Lewis for a minute and said, okay, let's use a grief observed, because that actually helps us find the center of the book. That was book 4, The Loss of the Friend. And then Augustine's great poetic conclusion about the fact that we can't find any rest in transient things. And even this very kind of addictive friendship didn't provide a place where his soul was at rest. Okay, so that brings us to book 5. So here's the rundown. Here's our candidates for best title. Chadwick, 1991, calls book 5 Carthage, Rome, and Milan. Okay, that gives us the geography. Bolding, 6 years later in 1997, calls book 5 Faustus at Carthage, Augustine to Rome and Milan. A little bit more color. If we go to the French edition, this is obligatory. The French edition titles book 5 The 29th Year. And so we see with each of these authors, each of these editors rather, they're drawing out one distinctive. The distinctive for Chadwick is, well, there's 3 cities involved, and this is important, and that's true. But Bolding says, well, the important thing is, Faustus shows up. This is also true. The French seem to think that since book 5 really focused on the 29th year, this is important. And all these things are important, that's true. But I think they missed the mark. And actually, I critiqued myself last time, but I'm not going to this time, because I think my title is actually the best. And it involves a little bit of a pun. But when I come to book 5, when I think about it, I entitle it Lucky Faustus. Lucky Faustus. And some of you are probably thinking, well, that's kind of corny. Well, but wait for it. There's a Latin joke in here. The Latin joke is this: Faustus's name, if you pick up the Oxford Latin Dictionary and look up Faustus, this is an adjective. Faustus means lucky or auspicious or bringing good fortune. And so it's just an absolutely fantastical providential irony that Faustus's name means exactly the role that he plays in book 5. And so I like it. You don't have to like it. But Lucky Faustus is how I think about book 5, because he is in an important way the center of what's going on. So speaking of the center, let's talk about structure for a second. So when we come to book 5, the internal structure of book 5 of the Confessions is not like any other book in the Confessions, because book 5 is actually structured around each of Augustine's geographical movements. And if you read book 5, you picked up on this. He's completely unambiguous. There are other books in the Confessions that involve geographical moves, but these are hardly mentioned. So in book 1, Augustine's describing experiences in his early education in 2 different locales. You might remember this. He's talking about his primary education in Tagaste, and then he's talking about the next level of his education that's in Medorus. But if you remember from book 1, this is not important to him. He never distinguishes where these educational experiences are happening, even though there are geographical moves. It's not relevant to his spiritual progress. This is the point. In book 4, which we just left behind, Augustine's memory in his confession is ranging back and forth between time spent in Carthage as a teacher of rhetoric and time spent back home in Tagaste, where the friend dies, also as a teacher of rhetoric. But you might remember from book 4, there's no clear demarcation. There's no point in time where Augustine says, and he doesn't even tell us explicitly that the friend died in Tagaste. This is we kind of work out. It's highly impressionistic. But in book 5, each move on the map is described with great precision by Augustine. People are named and not named, and the attendant circumstances of each of these moves are related in some detail. There's a point to this. This should signal to us that there's some spiritual significance attached. When Augustine moves kind of from impressionistic to precision of detail, it can be to tell that there's something spiritually going on that he's trying to draw our attention to. And in fact, in book 5, each one of the geographic moves that Augustine makes has some sort of spiritual advance associated with it. There's some step in regaining full rectitude in conversion. And so I've demonstrated this graphically. I'm going to move this though. Okay, everybody see the map clearly enough?
Yes.
Good. Okay, brilliant. So, book 5 starts in Carthage. Augustine gets frustrated. He actually describes the wreckers again. Do you remember them from book 3? He described, now he's the teacher though, he's not the student. He describes the wreckers. He's so frustrated. Makes the move to Rome where the students are supposed to be better. Gets to Rome, students aren't better. They're bad in a different way. Makes this fantastic encounter with a guy named Symmachus that we're going to park on in just a couple minutes. Gets a promotion, goes from Rome to Milan. In Milan, he's introduced to Ambrose. And so in this instance, in book 5, we can do something we can't really do with any of the other books of the Confessions, which is we can map this geographical progression that he's supplying to us. We can actually see as we work through this, each of these, the fact that it's northern bound is just coincidental, but each of these represents some form of ascent. Augustine's reached the bottom in Carthage of book 5. He's pretty clear about this. But each move, the move to Rome, and then the move to Milan, brings him back into contact with the Catholic Church in a meaningful way. Okay, so that's internally the structure. So Chadwick's titling makes sense, right? These are the 3 locations. That works. That is structurally correct. In relation to the other books of the Confessions, it can be said without too much controversy that books 1 through 5 have been describing the stages of Augustine's continuous and gradual descent into estrangement from God. This is definitely the pattern. I mean, book 1, he's making much ado about his childhood, and he perceives real sinfulness there, but it's still childish. He's clear about this. But then you get to book 2, and you've got the pear tree, which kind of sort of in a way is a character. And the pear tree incident is almost this reenactment of the fall. So, okay, it's graduated. Then you get to book 3, and you've got the incidents of the wreckers. And so he's kind of dabbling with this group that's essentially destructive. And then they actually become kind of this symbol of the Manichees, who he joins by the end of book 3. And he's in a really bad way at this point, he tells us. And then in book 4, there's the death of the friend. His response to this is just to keep sinning and sinning more, and it drives him into utter despair. Now we get to book 5. Book 5 then really serves as kind of a midpoint. And this, I don't know if this is necessarily intentional in Augustine's design, but it is the midpoint and it is the inflection point, because he's going to meet 2 people who are actually sort of mirror images of each other, or inverted images of each other, which is Faustus and Ambrose. This is going to be the inflection point where the descent stops and the ascent begins. And then in books 6 through 9, we're going to see Augustine's gradual ascent, the regaining of rectitude, ultimately full conversion. And then in book 9, what does the new life look like in its immediate development? Everybody happy structurally? Does this seem reasonably clear? Okay, good. Lots of nods. Okay, so that frames in what we're dealing with in book 5. So what I want to do, kind of as tour guide here, is just walk through a handful of key moments that I've cherry picked, either because they seem to be significant to just about everybody, or I personally find them interesting, or some combination of the two. And we'll talk through these. Interesting thing in book 5. Book 5 is notable in that in most of these instances, there is some text standing behind the text. Augustine's telling a story, but he's telling a story that he presupposes the original audience is familiar with the texts, the books that he's reading, and the texts that inform his outlook. And this develops rather interestingly. We're going to see a number of examples of this. So here's what we're going to move through at a pretty good pace. We got to look at the prologue, because we should begin detecting patterns. Augustine introduces each book of the Confessions with a prologue or a prelude, and he tends to end kind of on the same note. This again tells us, of course, we're not dealing with strict autobiography. Each chapter kind of is a self-contained memoir in a certain sense, but definitely a prayer. Okay, so we'll look at the prologue for a second. We need to stop for a second and talk about these philosophers. Who are the natural philosophers? Somebody disengages Augustine from the Manichees, but he doesn't, again, he presupposes that his audience knows this because Augustine and people like him had a certain education that followed a very predictable pattern in late antiquity. And there was a language that these guys spoke that they knew, like they could recognize one another anywhere in the empire based on the shared paideia, right? This formation they had as children, this formation they had as young adults. And so he's presupposing things that the modern reader, may or may not be altogether familiar with. So we'll talk a little bit about the philosophers. Who are these people? Why do they matter? Obviously, we've got to talk about the meeting with Faustus. We're going to very briefly say something about Augustine's abandonment of Monica, Carthage, because this has a lot of resonance to a text that he and his audience understood. I do want to say something quickly about Augustine's move from the dogmatism of the Manichees into this period of skepticism. And then I want to say something about Symmachus and Ambrose. It's a lot, but I think if we keep moving, we'll be able to tackle this. Okay, so the prologue. The prologue seems to be a place where Augustine is going to introduce and reintroduce us to kind of some standard themes in his spirituality and his outlook. And so the things we should be watching for throughout Confessions, but especially in the prologue, which is usually like the first chapter or two, psalm quotations. Basically anything that comes out of my mouth about the Confessions, you could put parenthetically because a lot of research has been done on this. So I'm not going to say it every time, but you could just assume every time I say anything of any interest, a lot of research has been done on this. But Augustine's use of the Psalms is actually a massively important subject of study, and it does repay us. You can always see the citation in a translation. Watch for Psalm quotes. Later in the book, I'll explain a little bit more why. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, the Psalms are quoted more than any other book, like 20, 30 times more than any other classical author, and they do contribute something to the structure. So keep an eye out for Psalm quotes in the prologue. A point that Augustine has been at pains to make since book one is that God is present everywhere. Someone at the end of the last session raised an interesting question. There was a certain author that they brought up, and I didn't know this guy's name, and then I Googled him, and I guess he's a Catholic who kind of has a pretty orthodox idea of this thing called panentheism. This is a new term to me. Never heard this before. So pantheism is that God is everything. Like we all understand this to some degree and reject this. So, okay, this is not true. This is not reconcilable with Christian revelation. But there is this idea that people have run with, maybe sometimes too far, of panentheism, that God is transcendent, but God is present in some way in everything. I think this is definitely a notion that Augustine has been trying to teach us since book one, that God is present in all places at all times. You can Google panentheism. I think people maybe get off the rails with it at some point. But interestingly, for the little reading I've done of this, Augustine's name barely comes up in this, which I found shocking because he seems to be someone who, I would appeal to if I was into this. Another point in the prologue that Augustine makes, and he's going to develop this throughout the rest of the book, is he says something interesting in the prologue about how creation acquires a voice through our contemplation of it. Just note this away, or tuck this away in your mind, because Augustine's going to draw heavily from a couple key biblical texts throughout the Confessions, and one of them is Romans 1. And it actually becomes pretty prominent in this book, and it's going to become prominent in other places. But this whole idea that what St. Paul's talking about in Romans 1, of course, is that, and he's actually addressing natural philosophers and paganism broadly, but he says effectively there is a certain element of revelation that comes through the created order, but people left to themselves misunderstand it, and they will actually suppress the truth that they could find in creation. And this becomes a very powerful Augustinian theme. Augustine says through the created things, through the visible things, the tangible things, these have been given to us to allow our minds to rise to the invisible and the intangible. This is just the theme, shows up in the prologue. The soul ascends to God through the created order. this is important for Augustine as a form of Manichae because the Manichaees had a very, very low view of anything material. Such a low view of things material that they refused to believe that God could actually be incarnate in Christ. And so the Christology of Manichaeism is, this is not Christianity. I mean, this would be kind of like, talking to a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness. I'm not picking on them, but I mean, their Christology is well known and they would defend this vigorously. I'm not saying anything they wouldn't say for themselves. But this whole idea that the incarnation is not, like, that's not really what happened. Like, God didn't actually fuse himself to human nature in the form of a human being. Well, this is what Manichaeism is saying. Augustine was affected by this. People are still affected by this. Naturally, in the prologue and in other places, always look for the prodigal Easter eggs, because this is everywhere. Augustine is alluding to the story in Luke and borrowing that and applying that to himself as the prodigal. Okay, so that's a thought on the prologue. So let's jump into this next part, which is the early part of Book 5. Augustine makes reference to retaining in his memory things he had read in the philosophers. And then he begins comparing this with the things that he heard about in Manichaeism. So we got to remember, Augustine is a massively educated person for his time. He's passed through all three stages of what was a truly classical education. He's had great exposure to all the elements of grammar, all the elements of rhetoric, and he's read broadly throughout the classical tradition. So what begins to become a tension point for him that he points to is, he says, well, I've been told by the Manichaees that what they have figured out about reality is true, and the way that they describe the nature of the cosmos and how it's organized, this is dogmatically true. But Augustine is retaining and remembering things from his training and saying, yeah, but this doesn't seem to fit. And he references something important for us to note. He specifically references the idea of being able to predict an eclipse. You probably caught this in the reading. He talks about predicting an eclipse, not the year, the month, the day, and whether it was total or partial. And this is the sort of thing that, in a NASA age, I mean, we're 3-4 orders of magnitude difference of development in astronomy from what Augustine is dealing with. So we take this for granted. But in antiquity, this was actually the genesis of philosophy as a discipline. Most people are shocked to learn this, but if we had to take an intro to philosophy class and say, all right, where does philosophy begin? The normal course of study is going to say, well, philosophy begins in or around Athens or the Greek territories in about the 5th or 6th century BC, when a guy named Thales successfully predicts an eclipse. This is considered the starting point of philosophy, and I'm not making this up. This is philosophy, Intro to Philosophy 101. And so Augustine is alluding to this, something that's part of his tradition, something that everybody in his circle understood, which is, oh yeah, the beginning of philosophy, of course, and this is in Cicero. It's when Thales predicted an eclipse, because this was the start of reason, the ability to make rational and accurate observations about the natural world that did not involve any kind of appeal to the Greek pantheon or Greek mythology. Like, this is the break point. This is the death of mythology in ancient Greece in a certain sense, is when Thales predicts this eclipse, because now the world is rational. Now the world can be understood in a way that nobody had been able to fathom up until that point in time. So the people that Augustine are talking about are actually referred to as the pre-Socratics. And I'll share something else here real quick. Okay, this is a painting that, if you don't know the name of it or remember the painter of it, it probably at least looks familiar. So I'm showing you this because it's called The School of Athens by Raphael, and there's no way for me to hide this so that you can see everybody. But basically, in the Renaissance, Raphael paints this, and he throws everybody into this painting that was ever really considered a part of the canon or the classical tradition. And of course, most importantly, what you've got here is Plato, who's pointing where? Up, right? The ideas. And you've got Aristotle, his student and kind of competitor in a certain sense, pointing out to the forms. This is the starting point that everybody in the classical tradition up to the Renaissance understood. The identification of most of these people has been done successfully, but you'll see there's a lot going on in here. You've got someone working out a geometric proof. You've got Diogenes the Cynic kind of sitting there doing his own thing, ignoring everybody. But the point of this is that the sorts of people, the pre-Socratics, Thales is on here somewhere, honestly, I don't remember where he's at. But the sort of people that Augustine has in mind and that his readership has in mind are the people in this painting. This is the tradition that Augustine is working out of. So the School of Athens, Raphael. So at this point in time, the world that Augustine inhabits is kind of working out of this Ptolemaic model of the universe. There's not been a Copernican revolution. You're not dealing with Newtonian understandings of what's going on. But this is not what the Manichees were presenting. I mean, they basically presented a dogmatic idea of how the universe came into being and existed and functioned that was diametrically opposed to the science that Augustine understood up until that in terms of the stage it had developed to up until that point in time. We can't dive into this now, but I can just tease you with this, and you can pursue this if this interests you. But the whole intersection of science and religion, or faith and reason, like this is one of those texts where there's been a lot of work done, but you could spend a lot of time really digging and meditating on this, and I think it would be of service to anyone who chose to do that. Okay. I do want to say one other thing that Augustine sneaks in here. So while he's critiquing the Manichees, he's also critiquing these early scientists, and he invokes this passage from Romans 1. So like nobody's getting away with anything in Augustine's confession here. He picks on the Manichees, and he says, well, I can use the natural side, the philosophers, the natural science, the early primitive natural scientists, to basically demonstrate objectively that Manichaeism is teaching nonsense, that I can do this. The problem, why didn't the natural philosophers, why didn't this turn into piety for them? This is the problem that he wants to explore here. That's important in its own right, but he says something that I think we need to log for the future. He critiques the pre-Socratics, he critiques the natural philosophers, but he does so in a way that we're going to have to prepare ourselves for, because we're going to see this in book 13. But he appeals to Genesis, and there's a little line in there, it's easy to miss. But he takes this and he does something allegorical with what he finds in the beginning of Genesis, which, no spoiler, this is all of book 13. He says this in respect to the natural philosophers, like a Thales or others. He says, they do not slay and sacrifice to you what they have made themselves to be. Okay. They do not kill their own pride like high-flying birds. They do not kill their curiosity like the fishes of the sea. They do not kill their sexual indulgence like the beasts of the field, so that you, God, who are a devouring fire, may consume their mortal concerns and recreate them for immortality. Two things going on here. One, this is Augustine's critique of natural philosophy. And he goes to some lengths about this. You can figure out how the world works. This doesn't put you in right relationship with God. Conversely, you could be a good Catholic person who's painfully ignorant of modern science. This doesn't make you a non-virtuous person who necessarily has to fail at excelling in faith, hope, and love. It doesn't work. Augustine's saying it doesn't work that way. The interesting thing, though, is he's already borrowing from Genesis. This is coming out of Genesis 1. So Romans 1, Genesis 1. He's bringing these together. This is coming out of Genesis 1. The high-flying birds, right? This is pride. The fish of the sea. This becomes curiosity. The beasts of the field. This is, people left to their basic instincts, sexual indulgence. He's beginning to use Genesis allegorically to explain things to us. We just need to trust me. When we get to book 13, you'll be glad I primed the pump for you, because he's going to go really deep into this. Okay, so what's the rub? What's the point of this? Well, the rub is this. Augustine, in his allegiance to Manichaeism, realizes Manichaeism demands this dogmatic allegiance to this complex and fantastic mythology of the universe, and this is not reconcilable with natural science, with things that I can know verifiably are factual and probably true. Augustine's summary statement on this is, of course, Mani wrote on matters of which he was completely ignorant. He's talking about natural science here. So let me share something else. Okay. This is from An illuminated manuscript. An illuminated manuscript just means somebody drew on various parts of the page. Sometimes the drawings are crude, sometimes the drawings are absolutely shockingly beautiful and gilded in gold. Depends on the manuscript. I think this is like 12th, 13th century Chinese manuscript. And this is a depiction, well, at least from the 12th or 13th century in China, of Mani, the Persian who was the person responsible for the birth of Manichaeism. So you may be asking yourself, wow, okay, a Chinese manuscript written in classical Chinese about Manichaeism? Yes, it's just one of those strange sorts of things of history. Manichaeism developed in Persia, which does, situate it to the east, and it actually spread. It kind of came into a bit of a wall in Rome. We talk about that later. But it actually spread like fire in China. And so you had Manichaeism surviving in China out until like maybe the 16th, 17th century, which makes this one of the longest surviving heresies or opponents of the Catholic Church that we've ever seen. Like it was viable for 12, 13, 14. I mean, Arianism died out in about a century or two. Donatism died out within about a generation or two of Augustine. Manichaeism, I'm just rattling off some of Augustine's beta noirs there, but Manichaeism survived for centuries, but not in Rome and not in Byzantium, but actually in China. So if you want some visual of Mani, he's Persian. This is as good as it's probably going to get. This is also from a Chinese manuscript. It's so long, it's like impossible to fill the page. This is the Manichaean diagram of the universe. I want to give you a visual of what is Augustine reacting to. Manichaeism takes a while to understand. Admittedly, I'm not a Manichaeism scholar, although it's kind of all the rage right now in Augustinian studies. There's a lot to figure out, but the picture does the work for us. This is Mani's idea pictorially of how the universe is organized. This is what Augustine is reacting to. And he's saying, this can't possibly be true. This cannot be how the world is actually objectively organized. Again, there's images here that represent something, but it's clearly mythical. It's not scientific. One last picture. This looks like something we would be far more comfortable with, right? Is this fair? How many of us imagine the universe this way? This giant tapestry. I mean, there's a hierarchy to it, and that's fair. This looks like something maybe medieval, but this isn't how most people conceive of the universe today. This looks like something we probably can relate to a little bit more easily. The surprise here, this diagram does not come from the 20th century. This is a diagram from the 3rd century. This is how well astronomy had progressed, that there was an understanding of the movement of the planets. There was the understanding there's some sort of retrograde movement that ancients could never account for. They didn't realize these things moved in an ellipse. We don't need to make this an astronomy lesson. But the point is, this is in Augustine's head too. He sees this and he sees this in his mind's eye, and his imagination. And he begins to realize, yeah, this is much more probable to be the way that the world actually works. And so, curiously, we don't think about it this way because we think of science and religion as categorically opposed to one another, which I think is probably wrong thinking. But Augustine actually saw the advance of science as being something that liberated him from Manichaeism. You don't find most people who say, well, yeah, I really got into the natural sciences and, astrophysics, and astrophysics, convinced me of the Catholic faith, convinced me not to be a Mormon and to pursue Catholicism. Maybe that story's been told. I've never heard anyone tell it, but that's more or less what Augustine is saying. Okay, happy with that on the philosophers and Mani. We'll move on from there. Okay, so let's talk about the meeting with Faustus for just a minute, because we have said this is the center point of the book. It is all rather transparent. Some of these other things are more behind the scenes. You got to dig them out. The pictures help a lot. The meeting with Faustus is not, it's not complicated. I mean, we can breeze through this in a minute or two. The introductory statement about Faustus is, I love this. He said the things they usually say, but he said it more agreeably. And so this is Augustine's introductory statement to Faustus. Who is this guy? Well, he's charming, he's good looking, he's polished. Okay, we have a word for this in 20th, 21st century American culture. What is it? He's a salesman. That's what Faustus is. I mean, he's a sales guy. He's charming, he's good looking, he's polished. He's not overly academic because that doesn't really work, but he knows how to turn a phrase, and he's really, really pleasant to be around. Like, well, those are the kind of salespeople I wanted to hire, and they're few and far between, but like, that's the person that I want. So Faustus is this. He's a guy who's style over substance. This presents problems for Augustine. The problem is that Faustus will not entertain Augustine's difficult questions in public. This is a problem for Augustine. Like, I have honest questions, you're supposed to be an honest guy, but like when I ask these, you really won't let me ask this in public. So this concerns me. The other thing that he discovers is that despite Augustine's vaunted reputation, this is a guy who's largely ignorant of the liberal arts. And so what Augustine realizes, like, he's been waiting. He's been waiting for the guy to show up that's here, right? And he visualizes himself here. But then he meets Faustus, and there's this role reversal. And Augustine realizes, well, wait a second. Like, this guy's knowledge of the classics is actually rather pedestrian. Everybody said this is somebody who could instruct me. But as it turns out, literally, Augustine says, I took Faustus on as a student. This is what goes on in book 5. He said, I came to Faustus to get my questions answered, realized he wasn't going to be capable, realized that he had very amicable ways of saying he didn't know the answer and didn't want to get cornered, but ultimately realized that Augustine saying, I'm actually kind of the alpha in this situation, intellectually and academically, and Faustus literally becomes his student. He says, Faustus would tell me the books that he wanted me to read to him. Note this, the books he wanted me to read to him, not the books we read together, not the assignments. This is how pedagogy worked. Augustine would read the text to him and they would discuss it together. And it's through this process that he realizes, as the tutor to Faustus, that this guy's not very impressive at all. I mean, he's a great sales guy. And this guy does not have the answers to the questions of the universe. Like, that's not what's going to happen here. So I would say the summary statement that Augustine ends on with respect to Faustus is this, and then we'll move on to Monica for a second. He says this, so the renowned Faustus, who had been for many a snare of death, this is a psalm quote, without his will or knowledge had begun to loosen the bond by which I had been captured. For in your hidden providence, your hands, my God, they did not forsake my soul. By my mother's tears night and day, sacrifice was being offered to you from the blood of her heart, and you dealt with me in wonderful ways. Wonderful is one way to translate it. It could be strange or bizarre or hard to explain ways. And this captures a main Augustinian idea. Faustus shows up, a guy who had been a snare. Augustine applies to him the Pauline idea of the snare of the devil. Is that this is a guy who's deceiving people and costing them their souls, but inadvertently, he ends up unhooking the snare from me. And this is the great kind of Augustinian lesson, is that people in our lives, willingly or unwillingly, deliberately or inadvertently, play their part in the grace of God calling to us. And this is the part that Faustus played. Okay, we're going to leave Faustus here until 1 minute at the end, which is coming up. So Faustus comes to Carthage. This episode is past. Augustine gets the call to move on to Rome. Just quickly for a second here, Monica gets abandoned at the shrine to Cyprian. She doesn't want Augustine to leave. She's begging, she's pleading. He's like, Mom, I've got to go, and no, you can't come with me. She won't hear it. So he says, look, just, you're devoted to the martyrs. There's a shrine to Cyprian here. Just go spend the night there. I've got to go see a friend off. You spend the night at the shrine to Cyprian. We'll catch up in the morning. Okay, she goes along with this plan. Morning comes, Augustine's gone. He catches the ship, and he is across the sea, and Monica is heartbroken. The scene has all sorts of value in its own, but the point I wanted to make about text standing behind the text, this is actually, and this is parenthetically, a lot of research has been done, everybody's noted this. This is actually almost a complete echo of Virgil's Aeneid, because Aeneas, who is in North African Carthage, has a relationship with a woman named Dido. She happens to be the queen. And he sneaks away at night. He sneaks away because the gods have told him, look, Aeneas, you survived Troy. Like, you've got to get to Italy and rebuild the Trojan people in Italy. This is the whole point of the Aeneid. This was a text Augustine memorized largely as a child. it's fascinating that in his own life, he's actually probably inadvertently living out, in a certain sense, this episode, because he abandons a woman who is heartbroken and he leaves Carthage, crosses the sea to Ostia, and enters Italy, which is exactly what Aeneas did. You might hear that and think, wow, okay, well, neat, right? But for the original audience, people who grew up on this text, this is beyond just the artistry being amazing. This has such a deep resonance for the Roman of late antiquity that Augustine is actually embodying, he's living out the character of Aeneas in his own way. I'd wanted to say something about the academics, but I'm going to skip that in the interest of time because I do only 5 or 10 minutes for questions. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening here. And so we're going to come to the conclusion this way. Chapter 13, Augustine's been in Rome.
Yeah. Okay. And you're sure you want to wait till tomorrow?
Yeah. Augustine's been in Rome. He's teaching. And then someone's introduced in less than a sentence, and Augustine just keeps moving. He says, well, Symmachus was prefect of Rome, and a message came from Milan to Rome that said, hey, we need someone to be the chief rhetor of the city. This is a government post. Like, you work for the emperor. This is not a joke. Like, this is what every little boy like Augustine trained for, was the opportunity. Milan is, of course, the center of the Roman Empire right now. It's the administrative center. Rome is not where the decisions are made by the 4th century. Most people don't think about this. Why would we? But Rome is actually rather provincial. Milan is actually where the action happens. This is where the emperor is actually living and making all the decisions. So the message from Milan comes down to Rome and says, hey, we need somebody. Symmachus is the guy who interviews Augustine. Augustine basically says, yeah, I performed for him. And he said, yep, you're the guy. And he sends him to Milan. And then in about the next sentence or two, Augustine introduces Ambrose, which for us is like, oh, okay, well, Symmachus, prefect of Rome, right? Not really famous to us, not important. Ambrose, okay, this seems way more important. Okay, but wait, the original audience knew something that we don't know, which is that Symmachus and Ambrose know each other. Augustine doesn't tell us this, and they know each other in a very, very interesting way. There's actually a huge backstory that I've got to give to you in about 90 seconds. It goes like this. In the Roman Senate, which was called the Curia, there was a thing called the altar of victory. So they made sacrifices to the gods. Constantine II, the son of Constantine, pulls the altar of victory out. It's part of kind of the depaganization of Rome after Constantine I, right? Okay. Symmachus is kind of representative of this elite, conservative Roman attitude that wants to see traditional Roman religion reintroduced to the state. This is still a conflict, right? This is going on. So he makes a proposal in 384. He writes to the emperor in Milan and says, I've got really good reasons. I want the altar of victory reinstated in the Senate house, this would be a win for paganism. I mean, paganism and Christianity are fighting each other still. The idea that like Constantine became Christian and everybody became Christian, that's a massive oversimplification. You have all kinds of individuals who are elites who are not interested in Christianity. Symmachus was one of them. He writes to Valentinian and says, I want you to reinstate this. Ambrose catches wind of it, and he writes 2 of his letters. We have these letters 17 and 18 to Valentinian, and urges him and says, do not let the altar of victory be reestablished in the Senate. And Valentinian sides with Ambrose. Symmachus loses, and the cause of paganism kind of getting back into the public forum is probably dealt its final setback. These 2 guys know each other. Ambrose, Symmachus. These 2 guys are political enemies, and they know it. And Augustine says in the same sentence, Symmachus sent me to Ambrose. And everybody reading something like Caesarianus 55 or hearing this is like, what? Wow, Symmachus is the guy who is the conduit of getting Augustine to Milan and Ambrose. Like, it's unbelievable to the original audience that that kind of divine providence could work out that way. So we'll end on this. Augustine makes his way to Ambrose. He gets to Milan. This is really the hinge of Confessions, books 1 through 9. This is the first real turn of Augustine back to the truth. And here's the point I want to make in relation to Faustus. I don't think Faustus there's only 3 or 4 people that get a lot of airtime in the Confessions. Alypius in the next book, Monica in book 9, Ambrose in the next book, and Faustus. These people are the people who get the most in terms of word count. My read of this, the read of others, Faustus, you can look at it one of 2 ways. Faustus is the anti-Ambrose, or Ambrose is the anti-Faustus, because Faustus is one of the highest ranking people in the Manichaean hierarchy. He is the representative. He is the spokesperson in the Roman Empire for Manichaeism. Ambrose is arguably one of the highest ranking spokespeople for Orthodox Catholicism in the Roman Empire. Faustus and Ambrose are actually kind of foils for one another, because Augustine teases all of this out. Everything that Faustus wasn't, Ambrose was. And he says, Ambrose was definitely dealing in the truth. He may not have been quite as entertaining to listen to as Faustus, which I think is a very interesting insight. But Ambrose represents what Augustine was aspiring to, what he was trying to find. And it is a very interesting twist of divine providence. He meets Faustus. That disappointment sets him up for Ambrose. It's Symmachus, the enemy of Ambrose, who feeds to Ambrose, the individual who would then become basically the greatest church father in Western civilization. So I think that's good for Ambrose. Let me say one last thing, and then we'll see if there's a couple of questions. Importantly, so yeah, okay, so I showed you the one of Manny, right? This is basically a guess. It's almost a caricature. If you're a Chinese artist in the 14th century trying to draw a Persian male from the 3rd century, right? Okay. This is not a caricature. This is a mosaic in the Cathedral of Ambrose in Milan, which is still standing. And this is period correct. Like this mosaic of Ambrose was done either in his lifetime or within 1 generation of his death. And so if you want an idea of what Ambrose looks like, if you happen to be in Milan, there are a couple of cathedrals to Ambrose. You definitely want to get to this one, because the other interesting fact, we'll get into this 2 or 3 times from now, this is the mosaic of Ambrose. The complete skeletal remains of Ambrose are about 75 yards to the east of this in the crypt underneath, which is fully accessible to visitors. So Ambrose is still very present with us. I want to end on an epilogue and then have a couple minutes for questions. We talked about Faustus. Augustine's had a lot to say about him. Confessions is written in 397, 398. Faustus managed to get himself banished. He was just too prominent, too well known. Manichaeism was quasi-illegal, and they kicked him out of Rome. He ended up on an island somewhere, probably 396, 397, I don't know, about the time the Confessions was written. Ends up on an island, writes this scathing critique of Catholic orthodoxy that is directed towards an unnamed Catholic opponent, which we can speculate on who this is, probably Augustine. And Augustine responds in 408, 10 years after the Confessions, with this, the answer to Faustus, a Manichaean. It's a pretty long book, but it actually contains the complete actual transcript of what Faustus wrote, and then Augustine's response line by line. And so if you ever want to see how clever Faustus could be, we actually have a complete book of his. This is fairly rare in the history of heresies, I think. So with that, we'll pause, see if there's a few minutes for questions, and we'll take it from there. I'll check the chat box to see. There's a note here from John about the contrast of creation-centered in Augustine versus panentheism, which I think is good. I don't see a question, but there's a great clarification here. The notorious difficulty for panentheism is its vagueness. It's incredibly difficult to pin down exactly what panentheism is, how it differs from rival models. Panentheism is intended to be a mediating position between theism and pantheism. Okay, I think that's very helpful. The Augustine's use of panentheism would be something interesting to explore, but I think we would have to qualify it and say it probably doesn't really match what people are actually talking about today. That's probably all the questions that were in the chat. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to talk about here in the last 4 or 5 minutes?
One more question, Kevin, at least.
Yes.
I just,
Margaret, okay,
I
yes,
just
please.
question in. Did you want to read it or should I read it?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the question.
I'm saying you said that Augustine said that Manichaeism did not lead to piety. What did Augustine mean, and what was the goal of Manichaeism? How were they really supposed to live life?
Sure. Yeah, so Augustine's critique of Manichaeism, it's not that it didn't have a system of ethics or even a rigorous system of ethics, or that there couldn't be some objective way to say this is a good Manichae versus a bad Manichae. Augustine's critiquing Manichaeism from the perspective, again, he's writing about these events 10, 15 years after the fact. He's critiquing this from the perspective of Catholic Orthodoxy. And he's saying this system contains a failed Christology that does not put a person who belongs to the system in a position where they can actually grow in faith, hope, and love, because this is he's basically saying this is a counterfeit Christianity. So someone could be a relatively good person. They could be ethical. He's not disagreeing with that. But he's saying in terms of living a life that pleases God in faith, hope, and love, Augustine would say that's not going to be possible for the person who's knowingly a Manichae.
Did Manny have a way? How were you supposed to live it out?
Mm.
Do
Well,
you pray? Do you sacrifice? I mean, what was the depth of it, or was there
yeah.
none?
No, there was an enormous amount. I mean, Manichaeism was a complex and ornate system, but you basically had two classes of people in Manichaeism. So you had this group called the hearers or the auditors, which is what Augustine belonged to, and these people basically were kind of a diaconate, kind of servants to the people that Augustine refers to repeatedly in Confessions as the elect. So you kind of have this priestly class that Augustine did not belong to, which was the minority. So they had to, for instance, observe like perfect chastity, zero sexual relationships. Part of this is driven out of the idea that the last thing you want to do as a Manichae elect is produce a child, because what you've done is you've taken spirit and you've embodied it in flesh, and this is horrifying to them. They want to reverse this. And so their notion of salvation is we've got to liberate spiritual realities from material realities. And so one of the exercises, what Augustine claims that he did, is he would go and gather food and bring it to these individuals who were called the elect, because they were not allowed to pick fruit themselves. They would eat this, and then literally the Manichaean teaching, as they would eat it and burp out, they would burp. They believed that they were exhaling the particles of God that had been stored in the material thing. And this all comes from this complex mythology of how good relates to evil. It's not even, I mean, it's even more bizarre than, I'm not picking on people, but I mean, if you really dig into Mormonism, for instance, this is not Christianity. It doesn't really claim to be. I mean, it's a bit of a bizarre system with its own kind of mythology. This is what Augustine's dealing with. Does that help in understanding the system? So there's a ritualistic element to it. There's a redemptive element. You do have a priestly class that's doing something for you to try to help you achieve salvation. But basically, this proceeds from a complete and utter hatred of anything material. This is why they couldn't believe in the incarnation, because they're trying to reverse this. Why would God, who's a spirit, ever become a man? This doesn't make any sense. We're trying to liberate all the particles of God that are trapped in the matter around us. God would never become a man. This voids the whole concept.
We have, I think Isabel has a question. Mary Lou has a question, and then we should probably cap this. But I would say anyone else who has questions that don't get answered, we do have the ability to post those questions on the website, and Kevin checks regularly and can answer. And for just those of us joining for the first time, what we're trying to do is introduce different concepts at various levels, but this is I think important to all of us, that we continue to exercise vigorously, if you will, our Catholicism, and think about things we might not ordinarily think about. And so it's a great opportunity to do that. And so Kevin, thank you again. But a couple more questions and then we can call it a night.
Sure. So as far as a question, would you say Ambrose had more depth, I think, compared to Faustus, and someone like Augustine, who had studied philosophy deeply was more attracted to Ambrose's mind than the superficial mind of Faustus. Yeah, I think this is exactly what Augustine says. I think the point that he makes, well, so here's the thing. When Augustine encounters Ambrose, he's more than met his match, he's met his superior. I mean, Ambrose is arguably one of the most powerful Catholic bishops in the history of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire in the West is about to end in a generation or two. But Ambrose is a massively powerful individual who actually came from the Roman nobility and came from a high government position in Milan into the church and became a bishop. So like, this is the guy Augustine's been aspiring to be his whole life. So Ambrose had all of that and then became a bishop. And so I remember once Neil Young said something about being a B student to Bob Dylan, which yeah, it's definitely true, right? But the point is, Augustine would say the same thing. He's like, I'm basically a B student of a guy like Ambrose. So he finally met somebody who could impress him intellectually. And then Augustine at the end of this book and into the next book is going to talk about the struggle of like, Ambrose is so interesting to listen. Like, I'm captivated. This guy is the master, but I gotta tune out everything he's saying about Catholic Orthodoxy because that can't possibly be true. And then in about a chapter or two, at the end of book 5, Augustine's saying, I went ahead and entered the catechumenate because Ambrose, I didn't want this to happen, but I was so captivated by this guy that eventually the truth of what he was saying sunk in. And it wasn't just the eloquence. It wasn't just that he's my rhetorical superior. It wasn't that he's everything I've ever aspired to be. It's the realization that this is a guy who's rescuing me from Manichaeism and he's rescuing me from skepticism. So yes, it's a long way of saying yes. I think Ambrose and Faustus are categorical opposites, both spokespeople for their communities, but of a very different ilk. Mary Lou says, I almost see St. Augustine as a distant cousin of St. Paul. Paul was much more stern in his teaching. Confessions. Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I'll say one thing in answer to this, because I know it's coming up on 8:05, and I can talk about this for another 2 hours, but I certainly don't want to test your patience with that. Augustine actually goes through another conversion experience that's not recorded in the Confessions, but is actually the incident that leads to the writing of Confessions. So after Augustine's a priest and a bishop for a few years, he actually has this pretty profound encounter through the rereading of Paul's letters, particularly like Romans, Galatians, Ephesians. He's going to read like the core theological letters. And Augustine goes through this kind of Pauline conversion of really recognize the whole idea of prevenient grace becomes central, but actually Paul's development of the ideas of predestination and election take hold of Augustine's mind as well. So yes, Augustine is going to be channeling the Psalms all the time. He's going to be channeling Paul all the time. But in terms of his sternness, by the end of Augustine's life, most of the works that he's interested in writing at the end of his life are on predestination and election. This is the topic he's interested in. And his system on this is definitely as rigorous as Paul. And this has caused controversy and concern that stretches to the Reformation and beyond, because Augustine's basically setting the agenda for how to talk about predestination and election. And this is going to be picked up every few centuries, and of course reaches its probably peak at the Reformation with the Calvinists and the Arminians and the Catholic response to all of this. So yeah, hopefully that helps. But if you're hearing Paul and Augustine, you're hearing correctly.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining. As a reminder, those of you who are joining for the first time, all of these have been recorded, so you can circle back at your convenience. For those of you who want a more a more basic formation, we also have essays with Augustinian friar voiceovers on the fundamentals of our faith in the resources section. We'll roll forward with these series on confessions, one per month, until about the end of the year. We'll also sprinkle in a few other events on Augustine and Augustinian spirituality. But thank you again for joining. Kevin, I can't thank you enough for doing this. Please, everyone, pray for Leo and for our church. And God bless you all, and have a good night. Bye.
Thanks.